Hook dropped the audience straight into the chaos. No warm-up, no introduction, just the sound of a fist hitting flesh and a man begging for his life. The trash cans didn't move when Marcus Holt's body slammed into them. They just accepted him, the way Chicago's South Side alleys accept everything that falls into them at night. Quietly, without judgment, without witnesses. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday. Not the kind of Thursday that makes the news. Not a holiday, not an election night. Just a regular, cold, miserable Thursday in October. The kind that smells like wet concrete and old grease from the diner on the corner of Wabash and 43rd. Marcus Holt was worth $2.3 billion on paper. He had 3 homes, one in Chicago, one in Malibu, one in the mountains of Colorado. He had a Gulfstream G700 parked at Midway Airport, a driver named Glenn who had worked for him for 11 years, and a personal security detail that tonight, for reasons that would later become very significant, he had dismissed early. He had dismissed his security detail because he was going to meet someone he didn't want anyone to know about. That part comes later. Right now, what matters is this. Marcus Holt, one of the 50 wealthiest men in the state of Illinois, was curled against a dumpster in an alley behind a dry-cleaning shop, and 3 men were taking turns deciding how much of his face they wanted to rearrange. The tallest one, who would later be identified as Devin Carr, 31, with 2 prior assault charges, wasn't angry. That was the terrifying part. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't yelling. He was almost methodical, like he was working, like this was a job. "You know what you did?" Devin said, and stepped forward and kicked Marcus in the ribs so hard the sound echoed off the brick walls like a gunshot. Marcus coughed, spit, tried to find his breath. "I'll pay you," he wheezed. "Whatever you want. Whatever number." "We don't want your money," said the second man, shorter, stocky, wearing a red hoodie. His name was Jermaine Wells. Jermaine hadn't hit Marcus yet. He was watching. His hands were in his hoodie pockets and his jaw was tight and his eyes were doing something complicated. Something that wasn't pure rage but wasn't mercy either. It was the look of a man who had been waiting for something for a very long time and wasn't sure now that it had arrived whether he actually wanted it. The third man didn't speak. He hadn't spoken since they'd pulled Marcus out of his car 2 blocks away and walked him here. Walked him, which was almost more horrifying than if they dragged him, because walking implied compliance, implied that somewhere in Marcus Holt's 58-year-old body, he understood that running wasn't an option. The alley was 40 feet long. One end opened onto Wabash. The other dead-ended against a painted brick wall advertising a cell phone company that had gone out of business in 2019. A single security light above the dry cleaner's back door buzzed and flickered, casting everything in that sick amber light that makes blood look black. Marcus reached into his jacket. Instinct, probably, reaching for a phone that Devin had already taken. And Devin grabbed his wrist and twisted it, and Marcus made a sound that wasn't quite a scream but was close enough to one that it should have been heard. Should have brought someone running. Should have made some insomniac peer out their kitchen window and see something and call someone. Nobody came. Nobody except her. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was 17 years old, 5'4", wearing a puffy green jacket 2 sizes too big for her, and carrying a backpack with a broken zipper held shut with a binder clip. She had just finished a closing shift at a bodega 3 streets over, and she was taking the shortcut she always took because it saved 6 minutes, and 6 minutes mattered when you had a geometry test at 7 a.m. and hadn't studied. Her name was Amara Osebansu, and she stopped at the mouth of the alley and she saw everything clearly, and she did not run away. She did not freeze. She did not pull out her phone and stand there filming the way the algorithm had trained an entire generation to do. She assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds. 3 men, 1 victim, no weapons visible, but that didn't mean nothing, and she made a decision. 1 move. That's all it would take. But before we get to the move, you need to understand who Amara was. Because the move didn't come from nowhere. It came from everything that had built her. And that story is the one that matters most. Hook, pause the action. Show us who Amara is. Make the audience invest in her so deeply that when she acts, they feel it in their chest. Amara Osebansu had been invisible her entire life, and she had decided at age 14 that invisibility was a superpower, not a punishment. Her mother, Grace, had come to Chicago from Accra, Ghana, In 2003 with $80, a borrowed suitcase, and a nursing degree that the state of Illinois would not recognize for 2 more years. During those 2 years, Grace cleaned hotel rooms on Michigan Avenue. She cleaned them so well that a supervisor named Patricia Holloway noticed and put her on the executive floor, where the tips were better and the guests were harder. Grace did that for 2 years, saved every dollar she didn't spend on rent, got her nursing license validated, got a job at Cook County Health, got promoted twice, got a small apartment in Bronzeville. She had Amara in 2007 and she raised her alone, because Amara's father was a complication Grace had closed the door on before Amara was born, and she never opened that door again, not even to explain it. What Grace gave Amara instead was this discipline, the specific kind that comes not from strictness but from watching someone you love work harder than any human being should have to work just to be allowed to exist in a country that wasn't built for them. Amara watched her mother do double shifts. She watched her mother study for continuing education credits at the kitchen table at midnight. She watched her mother never complain. Not once. Not to Amara. Grace saved her complaints for God. In short, efficient prayers that she said every morning in Chui before Amara woke up. Amara was a straight-A student. Not because she was the smartest person in the room, though she often was, but because she treated school like her mother treated hotel rooms. You do the job completely. You do it right. You don't cut corners because nobody is watching. You cut corners and it comes back. She had one close friend, a girl named Destiny whose mother ran the community center on 47th Street. Through Destiny, Amara had gotten access to the center's after-school programs, and through those programs she had found 2 things that would define her: debate team and jiu-jitsu. The debate team was where she learned that words were weapons, that a well-constructed sentence, delivered at the right moment with the right tone, could end a fight before it started. She had won 3 city championships by age 16. She had stood in front of auditoriums full of people who did not expect someone who looked like her to dismantle their arguments with the precision of a surgeon, and she had done it anyway, and she had learned to enjoy the silence that followed, that specific silence when an audience realizes they've witnessed something they weren't prepared for. The jiu-jitsu was her coach, Mr. Abra's idea. He had watched Amara argue with a boy twice her size who was bullying a younger kid, and he had seen something in her. Not recklessness, not the kind of bravery that gets people hurt, but calculation. He saw a kid who was counting something before she moved. He had pulled her aside after and said, "You've got the mind for it. Your body will follow if you trust it." She had trained for 3 years. She held a blue belt. She was small and she was female, and in the first month of training she had been underestimated by every single sparring partner, which turned out to be the best training she could have received. She had never used it outside a gym. Until tonight. But here's the thing about Amara, and this is the part that the news would miss completely, and the part that you need to hold on to. What she felt standing at the mouth of that alley was not heroism. It wasn't even courage in the way movies describe courage, as this clean, glowing thing that arrives when you need it. What she felt was simpler and harder and more honest than that. She was tired. She was 17 years old, and she was tired of watching things happen while people stood around deciding whether it was their problem. She had watched her neighborhood absorb violence for years, not because people didn't care, but because caring had been taxed out of them, because the city had made it expensive to intervene and cheap to look away. She had watched men get beat up. She had watched women get harassed on the train while 12 people stared at their phones. She had watched her geometry teacher ignore a kid getting jumped outside the school gates because he said it was a liability issue. She was tired of liability issues. She stood at the mouth of that alley and she calculated, not just the physical situation, but the thing underneath it. 3 men. 1 victim. She could not fight 3 men. She knew that. Mr. Abra had been very clear. Jiu-jitsu is for escape, not for heroics. You do not engage 3 people. You do not play hero. You create distance. You create disruption. You give the situation a new variable and you let the math change. She reached into her backpack, past the geometry textbook, past the sandwich Grace had packed for her dinner break. She found what she needed, and she walked into the alley. Hook the confrontation. Slow it down. Every second matters. Make the reader feel the weight of each decision Amara makes. She walked in like she owned the alley. That was the first thing Devon noticed, the walk. Not running in, not creeping, not the hesitant half-step of someone who knows they probably shouldn't be here. She walked in like she had an appointment, like the alley was a room and she had been sent for. He turned. Jermaine turned. The third man, whose name was Kelvin Rhodes, 27, who had barely said 10 words the entire night, turned. They saw a teenage girl in an oversized green jacket. Devon almost laughed. You lost, baby girl? Amara didn't answer that question. She had learned from 3 years of competitive debate that you never answer the question you're given when you can answer the question that matters more. She looked past Devon. She looked directly at Jermaine. She had done her calculation at the alley entrance, and her calculation had told her that Jermaine was the variable. Devon was committed. Kelvin was a follower. But Jermaine was still deciding something. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hands were still in his pockets, in the complicated look on his face that she recognized because she had seen it in the mirror on the days when she had to choose between easy and right. You know how this ends, she said. Not to Devon. To Jermaine. Jermaine blinked. That surprised him. People didn't address him first. People didn't look at him like he was the center of gravity in a situation. Walk away, she said. Right now. Before this goes somewhere none of you can come back from. Devon stepped toward her. He was 6'2". He had spent the better part of his adult life being the largest thing in any room he walked into. He was not accustomed to 5'4" teenage girls not flinching when he moved. I said, are you lost? I heard you, Amara said. I'm not answering that question. And here was the move. Not a punch. Not a takedown. Not any of the physical techniques Mr. Abra had drilled into her for 3 years, though those were ready, her body coiled and aware in the specific way that training creates, the way a sprinter's muscles fire in the blocks before the gun, not from thought but from preparation. The move was this. She reached into her jacket pocket and she pulled out an air horn. A bright orange emergency air horn, the kind boats keep in their safety kits, the kind that produces 120 decibels of pure, undeniable sound, the kind of sound that does not distinguish between neighborhoods, does not stay quiet because staying quiet is the neighborhood custom, does not respect the unspoken rule that says what happens in this alley stays in this alley. She held it up so all 3 men could see it clearly. I press this, she said. And every light on this block comes on in 10 seconds. Every phone on this street dials 911. Every person within 4 buildings looks out their window and sees your faces in that security light. She paused. You've got one chance to walk out of this alley as people who made a bad decision in an alley. After I press this, you're people who made that decision while the whole block watched. Silence. The amber light buzzed above the dry cleaner's door. Marcus Holt, bleeding against the dumpster, stared at this girl he had never seen before and would never fully understand. Kelvin moved first. He stepped back. Just one step. But one step in that direction was a sentence. Devon saw it and something in him recalibrated. Some internal math that had been running all night suddenly produced a different answer. He looked at Amara. Really looked at her. Not as a girl who had wandered into the wrong place. As a person who had chosen to be here and knew exactly what she was doing. Jermaine said quietly, to nobody in particular, I told you this wasn't the way. And then he walked out of the alley, past Amara. Not running. Walking. The same complicated look on his face, but facing a different direction now. Kelvin followed. Devon stood there for 3 more seconds, 3 seconds that felt to Amara like a separate smaller lifetime, and then he pointed at Marcus Holt and said something that Amara would think about for months afterward, something that didn't sound like a threat so much as a statement of unfinished business, a promissory note written in the amber light of a malfunctioning security lamp. This isn't over. And he left. Amara stood in the alley alone with the bleeding billionaire, and she lowered the air horn and she thought, no, it isn't over. Not even close. Hook. The story underneath the story. Why were those men really there? What did Marcus Holt actually do? The audience thinks they know, they don't. Marcus Holt told the police that it was a random attack. A mugging gone bad. He had been walking back from a late dinner. He didn't say with whom. And 3 men had approached him demanding his wallet and his watch, and when he tried to talk them down it had escalated. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Sergeant Yvonne Treadwell who had been working the South Side for 19 years, and she had heard a lot of things in 19 years, and she had developed a very specific sensitivity to the texture of lies. Not their content, but their texture. Marcus Holt's lie was smooth in all the wrong places. Rehearsed, like he had been composing it in the ambulance. She ran Devin Carr's name. 2 prior assault charges, as noted, but here was the thing about those 2 prior charges. Both were connected to the same employer. A construction company called Meridian Build Group, which had gone bankrupt in 2021, leaving 63 workers without their final 4 months of wages. Unpaid wages totaling approximately $2.1 million. The company's parent entity, a holding company called Lakefront Capital Partners, had emerged from the bankruptcy with all of its assets intact, while the workers lost everything. Lakefront Capital Partners was owned by Marcus Holt. The man Devin Carr had been beating in that alley was the man who had, in Devin's understanding of events, stolen 2 years of his life. Devin had worked construction for 11 years. He had 3 kids. He had been 3 months from paying off his car when the paychecks stopped coming. He had spent the following year in a legal process that produced nothing but attorney fees he couldn't afford, and at the end of that process a judge had ruled that the workers' claims were valid, but that the assets they were entitled to had been legally shielded before the bankruptcy filing, and there was nothing to be done. Sergeant Treadwell sat with this information for a long time. She was not naive about what the law required. The law required her to investigate an assault. Devin Carr had committed an assault. The fact that he had reasons, real, documented, legitimate reasons, did not change the legal category of what he had done in that alley. She knew that. She also knew something that doesn't fit neatly into a police report, which is that when you've worked a neighborhood for 19 years, you understand that crime and justice are not the same thing, and sometimes they move in exactly opposite directions. She called Amara in for a follow-up interview 2 days after the incident. Amara came with her mother, who took a half-day off work to be there, and who sat in the interview room with the particular posture of a woman who has spent her life navigating institutions that were not designed for her. Upright, contained, watchful. Sergeant Treadwell asked Amara to walk her through the evening again. Amara did. She was precise and calm. Treadwell noticed the precision, the way she organized information chronologically, the way she flagged what she was certain of versus what she had inferred, the way she answered every question without editorializing. It reminded Treadwell of good testimony, of a witness who understood that what you say and how you say it has weight. "You knew what that air horn would do," Treadwell said. "Yes," Amara said. "You knew those men would leave. I thought they would. I calculated that the risk of exposure outweighed whatever they were doing there. I was right. You weren't scared." Amara thought about that. "I was focused," she said. "Scared and focused feel the same from the inside. The difference is what you do with it." Treadwell wrote that down. Not because it was relevant to the report. Because it was true. What Amara didn't know yet, what she would find out 2 weeks later when the Chicago Tribune ran a front-page story, was what Devin Carr's attorney told a reporter in a statement that was careful and legal, and still managed to detonate a very large bomb in the public conversation about what had actually happened in that alley. The story wasn't about 3 men attacking a billionaire. The story was about what the billionaire had done to 3 men and 20 other men and 40 other men, and the specific machinery of American law that had made what he did possible and what they did criminal. And sitting in the middle of all of it, like a figure who had wandered into a chess game without a side to play for, was a 17-year-old girl in a green jacket who had not known any of this when she walked into that alley, and who was now going to have to figure out what she thought about what she'd done. Hook. Consequences. Choices. A confrontation that isn't physical, the most important confrontation in the story. This is where the story earns its meaning. Marcus Holt called her. He had gotten her number through his attorney, which was a thing his attorney had told him was legally fine but probably inadvisable. And Marcus Holt was a man who had built $2.3 billion by being good at calculating when to ignore advisors. He called on a Saturday morning, when Amara was doing homework at the kitchen table and Grace was at the grocery store. "I want to thank you," he said, "for what you did." Amara looked at her geometry textbook. She had gotten a 94 on that test she'd been worried about. She thought about that for a second. "I know who you are now," she said. "About the construction company." Silence on the line. She could hear the quality of the silence change, the way silence can get dense and careful, the way a rich man's silence is different from a poor man's silence because it contains lawyers. That situation was, "I'm not your audience," Amara said. "I'm not calling you out. I'm not going to the press. I'm just telling you that I know, so that you understand the context of what I'm about to say." Another silence. Shorter this time. "Okay. I saved your life. Or I maybe saved you from a very serious injury. I did that because I believe that violence doesn't fix what's broken, and because I believe that the moment you let someone get beaten half to death in an alley, even someone who did something wrong, you become a person who lets that happen. I don't want to be that person." She paused. "But I also want you to understand that those men didn't come out of nowhere. You created the conditions for that alley. You and your lawyers and your bankruptcy filing and the judge who let the assets walk." Marcus Holt was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Amara thought the call might have dropped. "I know," he said finally. It was the smallest 2 words she had ever heard from a person. Like he had spent money to say them. "Then do something about it," she said. And she hung up. The story, by this point, had become the kind of story that exists in 3 versions simultaneously. Version 1 was the police version. 3 men charged with aggravated assault. A victim who declined to press charges after conversations his attorney described as private. Version 2 was the media version, a viral moment, a teenage girl, a debate about vigilante justice and corporate accountability that lasted for about 6 news cycles before being replaced by other debates. Version 3 was the version that mattered, which existed mostly between people who knew the people involved. Devin Carr's charges were eventually dropped. The process by which this happened was complicated and involved Marcus Holt's attorney making a call to Devin Carr's attorney. And it did not constitute justice in any formal sense. But it was something. Jermaine Wells had never been charged. He hadn't struck anyone, had left when told, and Amara had specifically told Sergeant Treadwell that in her assessment Jermaine had been ambivalent about the whole situation from the start. Kelvin Rhodes received a misdemeanor and probation. Marcus Holt, for months after the alley, announced a settlement fund for the former Meridian workers. 63 workers. Full unpaid wages plus interest. His press release called it a moral obligation I should have honored sooner. His attorney called the reporters who called him and said the settlement was entirely voluntary and unrelated to any legal proceedings. Nobody quite believed that, but it was technically true, which in Marcus Holt's world was close enough to true to count. Amara did not go on television. She was invited, repeatedly, by 3 different networks and a podcast that had 6 million subscribers. She declined all of them. Grace asked her if she was sure. Amara said yes. Grace asked why. Amara said, "Because the story people want to tell about me is about the move. About the air horn. And that's not the story I want told about me." Grace had thought about that for a moment and then nodded in the specific way that meant she was proud in a way that didn't need to be said out loud. The story Amara wanted told, the one she was building with her actual life, not with television appearances, was the one she would spend the next decade assembling. She graduated high school the following June, valedictorian, and her speech lasted 6 minutes and said nothing about the alley and everything about what her mother had taught her, which was that dignity is not given to you by the people who have power over you. Dignity is the thing you protect with your decisions at 11:47 p.m. when 3 men are beating someone in an alley and the easiest, safest, most rational thing to do is keep walking and take the 6 minutes shorter route home. She went to the University of Illinois on a full scholarship. She studied law. She thought about Sergeant Treadwell, who had treated her like an intelligent person in an institution that often didn't. She thought about Jermaine Wells, whose face she still saw sometimes when she was half asleep. That complicated look, the one that wasn't pure rage and wasn't mercy. She thought about Devin Carr's kids, who had 3 months of unpaid bills and a father who had decided that after the legal system failed him, the only system left was the one in that alley. She thought about all of it. She held all of it at once, which is the difficult thing, the thing that takes real strength, not the 5'4" kind, not the blue belt kind, but the kind you build by watching your mother pray in Chui at 5 in the morning before the world gets hard again. The kind that lets you say, "I understand why you did what you did, and I understand why it was wrong, and both of those things are true at the same time, and the work is figuring out what you build in the space between them." That is the work. That is always the work. And somewhere in the city, in an alley behind a dry cleaning shop on Wabash and 43rd, a security light still buzzes, still flickers, still casts everything in that amber that makes blood look black. Still waits for the next person who has to decide, in 4 seconds or less, who they are going to be.